Right. Good afternoon and welcome to the first Chelmsford Mid-Essex CAMRA live beer tasting with Mr. David Sherman. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. First of all, thank the Hot Beer Shop on Moleston Street for providing all the beers for us today, and David, if you have got the beers in front of you at the moment, you can still believe you can still obtain these beers if you contact them as soon as possible, subject to availability and everything like that. So, all go. Over to you, David.
Right, okay, thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. Hopefully you can see me and hear me. I'm sure someone will tell me in a moment if they can't. Yes, my name is David Sherman. If you drink around pubs in Chelmsford as and when they're open, no doubt you've seen me before, or further afield, beer festivals all over the place. I chair the Essex tasting panel for CAMRA, which provides tasting notes in the rear pages of the Good Beer Guide and elsewhere. For beers brewed in Essex, and also provides nominations for Essex beers to go forward to champion beer of initially East Anglia, and then obviously the winners for that to go forward to national competitions, Champion Beer of Britain and Winter Beer of Britain. What I thought I'd do, I'd talk about brewing for a short time first, just to give you an oversight as to how beer is made. A lot of you probably know a fair bit about that already. But no doubt I'll say something that you haven't come across before, with a view mainly to talking about how different ingredients are used in beer to affect the flavour. And then obviously we'll go through the beers that you should have with you right now, and we'll see how that relates to what I've said in the introduction. You should be able to get in touch with us, and Jake will put questions to me if you post questions. I think that's on Facebook, and possibly via the YouTube channel as well. And as we go through, Jake will interrupt me and say, could you provide some information about this, or what do you think about that, or we've got an information request from somebody, and so on. So beer is made primarily, at least the kind of beers we drink in this country, from malted barley. Beer basically all over the world is made from malted barley, with a few exceptions that are brewed from other grains. Malting is a process by which you take grain and you start the germination process. So when the grain, which is obviously the seed of the barley plant, starts to germinate, the starch in the grain, which is what it's fundamentally made of, starts to break down into sugar. Starch and sugar being basically the same thing in a longer or shorter chain. You can think of it as being like making bricks. You make one big long brick and then cut it into little bricks to use. The chemical composition of the long brick is identical to the chemical composition of the short brick, but the use is different. So you start the germination process, but before that goes too far and the plant actually grows, which is not a lot of use to the brewer, you kill it. You kiln the malt, which basically involves putting it into an oven, and you can do that for various lengths of time. If you're looking for pale malt, which obviously is mainly used in, well, it's actually the basis of all beers, but is used exclusively in light coloured beers, then obviously that's not kilned for very long. You can kiln it for longer degrees of time to create all different sorts of roasting intensities, right through to a malt that is basically burnt, which is used in very small quantities, even in the darkest beer. If you use too much of that, your beer tastes horrible, tastes like ash. So you've kilned your grain, you've got your variety of different kilning intensities, mainly pale malt, and in the case of most reasonably powerful bitters, some crystal malt, which is kilned while it's still damp. It forms sugar crystals in it, hence the name, gives you more body. And if you're making a darker beer, you get some darker malt as well. Get your proportions sorted out, and then of course you have to do something to make it into beer. So you steep that in water and heat it up, and according to how long you heat it for and what temperature you heat it, the sugar breaks down further and various enzymatic reactions are started, which help us further down the line when it comes to fermentation. And you've then got a sweet solution of malty sugars, which wouldn't taste very nice to the modern palate. So what you do is you bitter that off. Various things have been used for bittering beer over the years, but the world about 500 years ago, possibly a little earlier, settled on hops as being the most effective and most versatile. There are many, many varieties of hops which are used in brewing, in fact even more that aren't. They contain various acidic elements, or rather the flowers of the hop plant do, particularly the flowers of the female hop plant. Male hop plants are not used in brewing. And if you crush open a hop flower, obviously if we were in a pub now or on a beer festival, I'd be passing things around and showing you all these wonderful ingredients, but at the moment we can't do that. So hops will contain alpha acids, humulones, which will flavour the beer. They also act as a preservative, which is certainly was useful back in the day when people drank beer because it was hygienic when water wasn't in its normal state. And they'll preserve the beer as well once it's brewed to stop it going sour. So then you've got a balance of sweetness from the malt, bitterness from the hops, and you then ferment the product to make it alcoholic. Obviously that works off a lot of the sweetness as well, because the alcohol is made by converting sugar. So you get less and less sugar and more alcohol the more fermentation takes place. Well, obviously the skill of the brewer is to balance all those things, to balance pale malt and darker malts, powerfully flavoured malts and lighter flavoured malts, the bitterness of the hops against the sweetness of the malt, the drying effect of fermentation against the sweetness that you started with. And that's what a decent brewer can do, hopefully over and over again with a fair degree of consistency. So that's a brief overview. I'll keep it brief because we haven't, obviously not being in a pub, we don't have beers in front of us. So if you have any questions on that, write anything through. Anything coming through yet, Jake?
Nothing yet.
No.
We're all good.
Okay, right. Well, we'll make a start on the first beer. Anything that comes to mind while we're doing this, get through to us. So the first beer is Oscar Wilde. So hopefully they're all in front of you. That's that one there. This is an example of a mild. Mild was the most popular beer style in Britain until the late 50s, when it was obviously overtaken by bitter for about 15 years, and then gradually lager became the dominant style, and bitter remains the dominant style of ale types. Ales and lagers, incidentally, all of what I've just said applies to both ales and lagers. It's just the fermentation is different. The yeast used is different. Lager is fermented with a yeast called Saccharomyces carlsbergensis, which ferments slowly at cold temperatures, whereas ale is fermented with a faster working yeast called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So we're having today 5 of the ale type and 1 of the lager type. This, obviously, being a mild, is an ale. So what you want to do is to take your glass and pour some beer in, pour it gently, otherwise the head will obscure the aroma. And don't pour all the beer. I don't envisage that people will be drinking all this beer while we're doing this tasting. You'll probably want to be somewhere between a quarter and a third full, and obviously you can drink as much or as little as that as you choose. And then you can recap the bottle. That will keep it in reasonably good condition. Obviously, these beers are in high condition anyway. The word condition in that sense means amount of carbonation dissolved in the beer. Bottled beer being in higher condition than regular draft beer. So it will only go, it won't go completely flat if you drink it in a few hours' time. It will simply be similar to beer you buy from a hand pump, hopefully. So there you've got your drink. You'll see that is dark. Not all milds are dark. A lot of people, it would appear, think they are, but there are several light milds on the market. Tim Taylor's Golden Best is a prime example. Robinson's Hatter's mild. Milds around the south of England tend to be dark. That you'll see is sort of dark brown red in colour. Hold it up to a light source if you can. Take a look through it. You'll also be able to check the clarity of that as you do so, and you'll see that is clear as it should be. And get some impression of the aroma. So stick your hand over the top and give it a good swill around. You build up the gas off the beer in the headspace of the glass and take it to your nose before you take your hand away and give a good sniff. Okay, so you're getting there a beer that is predominantly fruity in the aroma. There's some indication of roast grain. Obviously, there wouldn't be very, very highly roasted grain in this. This is a mild, it's not a stout or porter. Mild, incidentally, is a term relating to the flavour of the beer, not to the strength of the beer. Back in the day, the distinction was mild or old. Mild was a younger, fresher beer when a lot of older sour beer was drunk some centuries ago. More recently, obviously, the distinction is between mild and bitter. Mild is less heavily hopped than a bitter, and certainly less so than a golden ale. So if you smell that, you won't be smelling a lot of hop aroma on that. You're not getting citrusy aromas. Some very delicate hop character, but not very much, which is correct. I mean, that is what you would expect from a mild. So let's give it a taste. Take one mouthful and swallow it straight down, and then swill the second mouthful right round your mouth for a few seconds. Then after you've swallowed it, breathe in through your mouth. That will give you a good impression of the balance of flavours in that beer. Here we go. So what you should be noticing there is that the mouthfeel to that is initially smooth, and flavour is predominantly sweet. And then round about now, which is I guess about 10 seconds after swallowing it, the bitterness is starting to increase, and you're getting a more acerbic aftertaste, and not terribly so compared to a lot of beers, obviously, but you'll notice there's a change through time after tasting the beer, which is the case with most beers. Most of them will tend to be drier after a few seconds. Hop characters coming through, and quite a bit of bitterness, actually. There is quite a lot of bitterness there by the standards of a mild. Don't be afraid to have more of a taste. Yeah, so on the second mouthful, I'm noticing more of a roasted malt flavour in that, the sort of coffee or bitter chocolate element, but predominantly in the main mouthfeel sweet, which is what you'd expect for that style. More bitterness than you'd expect for most milds as you get to the end, but certainly not inappropriately so. It's certainly within the style. And when we obviously have beer competitions such as Champion Beer East Anglia, beers are judged according to how well they suit the style, as well as to what degree they taste any good. Hopefully by the time you get to the finals of a national beer competition, they should all taste pretty good and be in style. So that's in style for a mild. It's not any other kind of beer. It doesn't have overwhelming citrus tones or anything that we would consider inappropriate. Yeah, that's I think very good. Beer Mighty Oak, I think, are generally very good. I'm not being paid to say that. I think they're certainly yeah, one of the best beers around East Anglia. Make a variety of very good beers. One more mouthful and then we can move on, or take questions if Jake has any.
Unfortunately, I haven't got any questions at the moment. I'd just like to point out that Oscar Wilde Mild won Supreme Champion Beer of Great Britain in 2011, and they won Champion Mild of East Anglia in 2016. If anybody's interested,
they certainly
won awards. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they've won Champion Mild of East Anglia on a few occasions. Actually.
Yeah, that's the only one I got a date of my notes.
Yeah. After a while, they stopped printing them. If you're still printing, saying you won an award 15 years ago, it's a bit desperate, I guess. But no, they have on many occasions, and won Champion Beer of Essex before as well. Yeah. And yes, as you say, they were voted the best beer in Britain, Champion Beer of Britain, and whatever year you gave a few years ago.
There was 2011, and I was actually at that presentation, and it was absolutely it was all the breweries around Essex were in total cheer for them. It was it was a nice event that year.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Okay. Well, let's move on to the next beer then. So process is basically the same. Once you've opened the beer, pour out something between a third and a quarter. We're moving on to this one. I'll just show you in case you've got any confusion. It's Black Sheep Ale. I think on some of them it says Black Sheep Bitter. I can't remember if that's the same beer or if they changed the name or what it was. But anyway, Black Sheep Ale is what we have next. So take a glass. Pour that in. So yeah, Black Sheep was set up by Paul Theakston of the famous Theakston brewing family in the Yorkshire town of Masham. And yes, it is pronounced Masham. Theakstons, the older among you will remember, were bought out by Scottish and Newcastle in the late 80s, early 90s, and Paul Theakston jumped ship, not wanting to be an employee of a national brewery. He had always expected that he would be running his own brewery, Theakston's, so he buggered off and set up his own brewery, Black Sheep, and they're very successful, and they're pretty large actually for a micro. I went to their brewery several years ago, and it's quite a sizable premises. It's actually based in an old Victorian brewing building just outside Masham. Well worth a visit. And they make largely traditional Yorkshire ales from the time when still applies to the family brewers. There was a distinction between ales in different parts of the country. It applies less, of course, to micro brewers who tend to experiment and do different things with their beer as suits them. So here we go. One traditional Yorkshire bitter. First thing you'll notice is quite a different colour to what we had before. Sort of copper coloured, I would say. Copper, paler than what we call a tawny bitter. More condition in this as well. You'll notice it's fizzing more. So let's get some impression of aroma on that. Yeah, so you'll notice that smells quite different to the previous one. There's an element of sulphur in that, not unpleasantly so. Sulphur in this aspect comes off the water, probably magnesium sulfate in the water, which is particularly good for brewing. That may well be something that's in the water around that part of the world anyway, as it is in Burton-on-Trent, certain areas of the country and indeed of the world having good brewing water. So yeah, with that sulphur, you'll also be getting more hop aroma, most definitely, compared to the previous beer, and quite a bit of caramel aroma in that as well. There's an indication of forthcoming sweetness in that. Obviously, you can't smell sweetness, but you can smell things that indicate that it will taste sweet, as you should be there. Yeah, sort of orangey hop in that, a deep orange, not a sharp orange, but a sort of blood orange smell. Yeah. So, as we did before, give it a taste, swallow the first mouthful straight down and swirl the second one around your mouth. Okay. Yeah, so you'll immediately notice that that is very different from what we had before. Much more bitterness is immediately apparent in that. And that orange that you smelt in the aroma comes through after 5 or 6 seconds, really quite noticeably. Yeah, increasingly bitter. But that's underpinned by a typical characteristic of northern and particularly Yorkshire beers, which is known as rough sweetness. It's very difficult to explain, but you sort of know it once you've tried it a few times. Yeah, it's not the kind of taste you would expect to find in a traditional southern British or Welsh bitter. To a degree, you find it in Scottish ales, which are sweeter generally. And you'll notice the mouthfeel is quite different there as well. Whereas you had a grainier mouthfeel in the previous one, this has actually, although it's dry and grainy to start with, there's a creaminess comes into the mouthfeel. Give that another go. Yeah, that has a good development of flavour. Good characteristic of a well-made beer is that when you go back and drink more of it, it tastes different to the first mouthful, which obviously is generated by your tongue becoming accustomed to the presence of different chemicals and noticing other ones that you didn't notice the first time round. Yeah, so that's quite a full-bodied beer. There's more body to it than there was in the mild, which is what you'd expect. It's actually quite a thick feeling beer for its style. Obviously not in the way that a very strong ale or a stout would be, but it's got more oomph to it than just a typical session beer. It is, of course, what we might call a best bitter, a 4.4% bitter. So would probably be the next strongest beer. I think they must make a beer that's about 3.8%. That probably is Black Sheep bitter. This is, yeah, what we call the best bitter, which is basically a mid-strength beer. Yeah, I think that's very good stuff, which is what we were expecting. Okay, so let's we'll start to make a move to the next beer. Do we have any comments coming in, Jake?
I have no comments or questions at the moment.
No.
I've got praise for Oscar Wilde Mile for the first beer.
Yes.
That is about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So staying in Yorkshire, but moving to quite a different kind of beer. We have this one here. This is Samuel Smith's, which, if you followed my instructions, you will notice immediately is somewhat cooler than the beers we had before. I took mine out of the fridge about an hour ago, which is about right. Beer at fridge temperature, even though it might be what you expect from a foreign style, a lager or so on, you don't really get a lot of taste out of it. It's best to bring it up to something closer to room temperature, although a lager obviously should be drunk cooler than should an ale. So yeah, this is Sam Smith's imitation of continental beer. Samuel Smith's, for those who aren't aware, quite a large brewery in Tadcaster, set up by Samuel Smith, who was brother of John Smith, who also still, I think, have a brewery in Lancashire, albeit that's been part of Scottish Courage or whoever now owns that, probably Heineken, for many years. Sam Smiths have remained independent, even tells you on the front. A small independent UK brewery. They're not that small by modern standards. They own, I would say well over 100 pubs, including a lot of pubs in London, which are very good, and all the beer in their pubs is made by Sam Smiths, either at the Sam Smiths Brewery in Tadcaster or at their second plant in Melbourne in Lincolnshire, I believe, which is what they used to make fruit beers in the Belgian style. Their beer is largely traditional Yorkshire beer, as similar to we've just drunk. They make a very good Guinness imitation, a nitro keg stout, and also a strong ale, Stingo, which you can get in all their pubs. Unfortunately, they sell it in pint bottles, which seems to defeat the object unless you're out with a friend. But anyway, this is their version. They make all their own lagers as well, 4 or 5 different lagers. This here we have the organic lager. So this is not a traditional Yorkshire beer, of course, but it is a traditionally made continental beer, made in Tadcaster. So obviously, as you'd expect from a typical lager in the Pilsner style, it's very pale. We'd probably call that golden in colour. Give that a good swirl round. So you'll notice immediately that is much more delicate than the beers we've had before. Pilsner is a lightly flavoured beer, even at a high strength, which this is in the scheme of things. I think this is about 5% alcohol. Yes, it is. So much less aroma. There's some slight citrus on that, which we've not really picked up that kind of thing before, other than the deeper orange in the previous beer. And what you should be smelling in that as well is a sweet corny smell, which is typical of a Pilsner style. And that's dimethyl sulfide, which is derived from the grain. In excess, that is a fault in any kind of beer, but is typical of a lager in suppressed amounts. And there's a slight sulphurousness generally in that, as there was in the previous beer. Right, let's give that a taste in the same style as before. Yeah, so quite different again. I mean, that's what we'd expect with any selection of beers like this. They're designed, or the list has been selected to be different each time. Much crisper, much lighter in the body than the previous beers. There's a sort of lemonade element to that, not the intense bitterness you get off certain lemonades, but it's that fizzy, citrusy idea.
Sorry to interrupt. I do have a question. I have been asked if they use a square flint fermentation vessels at all.
Yes.
That was Facebook.
Yes, Sam Smiths do use traditional Yorkshire slate squares. I think they even brew their lager in traditional slate squares, but then obviously it goes off to a different fermentation process. I may be wrong with that. It doesn't mention that on the bottle, but yes, their traditional Yorkshire beers are definitely brewed in slate squares. Yeah, it would be interesting to know how they reconcile that with the lager, because this is a properly brewed lager. This is not just an imitation that goes halfway. This is authentically brewed, which obviously involves cold fermentation for a week or more. But yes, as a brewery, certainly slate squares are used, as I believe they are at Black Sheep. They obviously had new slate squares built when they set that brewery up. I can't imagine they were still there from the old brewery that had closed decades before. So let's have another taste of this. So you see that is, although it's got that crisp taste and there's some amount of hop to it, but then you'll get a slight malty warmth, a biscuity taste comes through underneath the bitterness. But it's very light-bodied, which is not to say it's bland. There's a fine line between bland and subtle, and unfortunately the appreciation of subtlety in beer seems to be a dying art with so many very, very intense beers being produced by small microbreweries with huge amounts of hops and or alternatively in stouts and porters, a huge amount of roasted grain, very much the in-your-face style. People quite often mistake subtlety in a beer like this and certain milds for blandness. So it's not bland. It's certainly clean tasting, and well balanced. Yeah, eminently drinkable. Not terribly much bitterness, but that is obviously in keeping with the style. Lager is a much more lightly hopped beer than most ale types, and uses the same hops. I don't know what the hops they specifically use in this, but lager, as a rule, uses the same hops that are used in a lot of golden ales. It's just golden ales use 5 times as much and give you that big hoppy, citrusy whack on them. In a lager, it's a much lighter and subtle interpretation and usage of the hop. So that was Sam Smith's lager. When the pubs are open again and you can get about into London, go out looking for some of their pubs. They really do brew a pretty wonderful selection of beers, just about any style you can think of except mild. I guess they used to brew a mild and found there wasn't the demand. But there's some lovely pubs they've got as well. They have no music and no television and no loud machines and just people sitting and chatting and drinking beer. It's terrible. Right, we've got any more questions coming in there, Jake?
Only one at the moment. Is someone's asked, is it vegan?
Good question. It's organic. Yes, it is. Yes, there's actually a vegan sign on the back of the bottle. You've got a Soil Association organic sign and a vegan sign. So yeah, that the vegan element, just in case anyone's worried or confused, given what I was talking about earlier in the brewing process and thinking everything I mentioned was vegan. There is another process involved in beer production called fining, which is the process by which sedimentation is taken out of the beer, specifically the yeast, but also residual bits of grain and so on. So you get a nice clear beer. Traditional finings in beer have been made from fish, which sounds like a peculiar idea, but inside large fish you have a sac, a swim bladder, which helps them to align themselves and float and so on in the water, and that's made of a collagen type substance which attracts yeast to it, attracts sediment. So you put some of that in the beer and that settles. It's like a thick glue and it forms a microscopic net that drags everything down. It's also electrolytic, so things attach to it like magnets, and as that sinks into the beer, everything gets dragged down with it, all the sediment on the bottom. But obviously that means your beer is not vegan, so vegetarian options are available in the beer world. You can use a derivative from seaweed, for example, which is known as carrageenan or Irish moss, and that has a similar function. So plenty of beers like that now exist, and Sam Smith's certainly organic lager is one. I don't know about their other beers, although I'm sure that's available on their website, although Sam Smith's are the kind of brewery that might not have a website yet. I suspect they do. Right, if there's no more questions or comments, we'll move on to the next beer.
I got one.
Yeah, let's do that first.
Hang on a second. It's by David on YouTube.
Uh-huh.
Is it made by popular singer Sam Smith? Thank you very much for that one.
No. No, I don't think popular singer Sam Smith was around in 17, whatever it was, to set up that brewery with John Smith. No.
At the moment, we have a slight problem with some comments, but we are working the problem, so we are getting there.
Yeah.
I like to say that, but quick check through. As soon as I get any questions come through to me, I will pass them along as soon as I possibly can.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next beer, and if we suddenly have to jump back to talking about another beer, so be it. So we'll move on to this one next. This is from Colonel Brewery. This is moving on from the well-established two breweries from before and a long-established micro. This is a much newer micro. I don't know when Colonel was set up, but they're certainly new in the scheme of things. A London beer. Now, this is a bottle-conditioned beer, so be careful when you handle this. Otherwise, you'll end up with a cloudy beer that tastes more of yeast than it does of anything else. So, this is an export porter. That doesn't necessarily mean it actually gets exported anywhere. That's just a term that brewers use for the stronger version. It always used to make me laugh that you could buy Heineken export and Carlsberg export in this country that had come all the way from the same brewery in Britain that the non-export version came from. It was Foster's export for a while as well, but let's not bring out the swear jar. Right, so this is a strong porter. It says India on it, export India porter. The term India in beer refers to when beer was shipped out to troops and the colonial administration. As I mentioned earlier, beer is preserved by hops. It's also preserved better if it is stronger. So beers such as IPA, a traditional IPA, as was, not what passes for it in certain circles now, would be strong and highly hopped. Then this is an export India porter, strong and highly hopped. We're having trouble recapping that one. There we go. So, very different to what we just had, as you can see. As good as black. There are really only three colours for beer, which are brown, yellow and red. But that we're not really getting much through at all. That is very, very dark red, I suspect. Yeah. So, yeah, porter and stout are very, very dark beers. The distinction is rather confused over time. CAMRA's actually recently revamped its beer classification styles for competitions and has put stouts and porters back in the same category again. They did go through some years of having a champion stout and a champion porter. From now on, they're running two classes, which are stouts and porters up to 5% and stouts and porters over 5%, or some strength in that region. The stout originally was simply an adjective that meant strong, and it became applied to stout porter, but you could have a stout pale ale as well back in the day. But now stout and porter are as good as the same thing. For many years, stout was considered to be the drier version that had unmalted roast barley in it, and porter didn't, which is still a distinction that's maintained by a lot of brewers, but the distinction has become so blurred over time that CAMRA's found it impossible to get the beers in the right classifications and given up. So this is a porter rather than a stout, according to the brewer at least. You'll notice there's very good head retention, a lot of condition in that, and quite a different smell to anything we've had on the previous four, much different even to the darker beer, the mild that we started with. Yeah, a very strong coffee smell, but a lot of hop as well. Yeah, sort of citrusy, a slight lime element to that. Doesn't dominate the smell, but it's certainly there. And peppery as well. That's a hoppy thing. You get a peppery resin in hops that gives you that zing on the nose. And there's a sort of vegetal smell in that as well. Vegetal smells are often regarded as faults, and some of them most definitely are. And that's where you get the very strong corn and cabbage and things from, but that's not what this is. There's a sort of a freshness to that. Celery, perhaps? Doesn't mean they put celery in the beer, of course. These are just things that derive from the fermenting process. And as you leave alcohol in an aqueous solution of acid for a long time, the alcohol breaks down into the fruity esters of acetone, which give you all these wonderful smells and tastes. So that's possibly what that is. So we can get an impression from the aroma of that this is going to be pretty powerful stuff, I think. So let's see if that is borne out by the taste. Yes, most definitely. So yeah, that's very full body, very heavy. I don't mean heavy in a pejorative sense, but there's a lot there. A lot of roasted taste, that intensity, that sort of coffee that we picked up slightly in the mild is there much more in this beer, as you'd expect. Bitter chocolate. And a slight dusty element to that as well. A lot of bitterness coming through. There's bitterness from hops as well as bitterness from the roast grain. Quite a lot of hoppiness actually, in sort of 20 seconds after you've swallowed it. But at the same time, plenty of balance. There's a lot of sweetness there. Yeah, that's good. That's not one you drink pint after pint of all night, I hope. Not only because of the strength, but also because of the intensity of the flavour. But it's not designed for that. It's designed for your last one of the night. Yeah, a big whack of flavour in there, isn't there? And although there's a lot going on, that all works very well. It's very easy in brewing to have all these flavours that don't quite marry up with each other, and you just end up with a mess, with all that hoppiness and all that roastiness and all that sweetness that could have turned into a car crash, but it hasn't, because it's, as I was saying earlier, the skill of the brewer is to balance things, to keep flavours separated to a certain degree and to keep them melded to a certain degree. So a lot can go on without it being unpleasant. Yeah, I think that's very good. Do be aware, I'll say this now, I say this when I'm on tasting panels as well, particularly when we have the final of a competition and you're starting, as we are now, with a mild and then a bitter and then another bitter and a golden ale. You tend to find that people score higher and higher as you go through the tasting, because you're getting more and more flavour. Obviously the beers are presented as they are today in an ascending order of intensity. The thing is to remember that intensity of flavour is not the be-all and end-all. It's quality of brewing. You'd want a very intense flavour for that kind of beer, or for a barley wine. You wouldn't want a great intensity of flavour for a mild. So a mild that is much less intense than that can be as good a beer as a beer that is stronger in its flavour. It's about achieving what you set out to achieve in the style you're making. So that is very good. And the beers we had earlier, I think, are very good too. How are we doing with the comments, Jake?
Sorry, I've got no questions at the moment. Just some comments about the beers. Bear with just 2 seconds. Someone just asked me a question on a different application. Bear with me 2 seconds. About being bottled condition, should you leave the yeast in the bottle of the bottle and do not drink it? I believe I'm reading that correctly.
Yes, so a bottle conditioned beer has yeast in the container, as does a cask beer, basically. So yeah, you need to store that carefully, keep it upright now you've poured it, and when you come back to it, pour it very carefully. If you look at it, you'll actually see a little white line around the base of it, and that is the yeast. A bottle conditioning brewer who does it properly, a lot of them don't, uses a yeast which settles and is quite sticky. So although the yeast is in the bottle, as long as you're careful with it, the yeast will stay in the bottle. But yeah, when you pour it, don't pour it all out. Leave that much or so in the bottom, and then, if you so desire, at the end you can swill that round. All the yeast will come off the bottom, and you can drink that separately to the rest of the beer. Some people like to do that. It's good for you. It's full of vitamin B12 and other good things. But I wouldn't recommend pouring it all into your beer because, as I said, the beer will then just taste more of yeast than of what you're actually wanting to taste, which is a problem you get with certain unfined beers on draft. And I sometimes wonder if they've started calling them unfined beers because they have trouble getting them to settle rather than actually a style of beer. Some unfined beer is very good, of course, but as with the bottle conditioning, it's a matter of how you do it. If you know how to do it and you do it properly, it's good. The thing is, of course, that there's no need to add gas to that. That beer will ferment and it will gas itself in the bottle and preserve itself, as well as the hops being a preservative. The carbon dioxide is as well. And that's obviously what is technically real ale in a bottle rather than a bottled version of a real ale, as the first two were. Anything else, Jake?
Inadvertently, you just answered a question I was going to ask. Ask you for a Phil Winter. If I'm sorry if I pronounced this wrong, a Phil Wilton Hund on YouTube. I think you just answered your question there.
Yeah.
And other than that, it's people are very enjoying the Colonel. Personally, I very much enjoyed their beers over. God knows, they've been going, must be 10 years plus now, down in Bermondsey in London.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And before the elusive COVID hit, they just opened up the tap room.
Yes.
So hopefully, in the near distant future, people can go in to enjoy their beers because they do some lovely pale ales and really hoppy pale ales as well.
Yes, I've only had one of their beers before, and that was quite recently. So I didn't know they'd been going that long. Right.
I'm not too sure how long they've been. I know it's been for a while. I just had another question. Oh, hang on a second. I just think I had another question come through. Is it unfiltered or just laziness? Leanness.
Laziness.
Yeah, I know.
No, it's not. It's not laziness. I think unfined beer and unfiltered beer does get used to cover a multitude of sins and incompetences among certain brewers. But no, this is a genuinely well-made bottle-conditioned beer. There's plenty of good bottle-conditioned beer out there, and this is one of them. And as I say, if you know what you're doing and you do it properly, that's exactly the way to go about it. Certainly with a beer like that, that I think would not taste the same if that was filtered off and served as an unyeasted bottled beer. Right, let's move on to the next beer then. You'll notice I've been having a good drink of water there because we've gone from a very roasty beer to something quite different for the next one. It's always difficult to know when you get to this end of the scale which order the beers should go in. Should the very roasty beer go before or after this kind of beer, which is this kind of beer? This is Jaipur. Once again, India comes up. This is an India Pale Ale. I've mentioned some of the story before. IPAs came out in the late 18th century to go out to colonial troops and so on in India. When I was first out in pubs, IPA was just used as a term for a regular session bitter. There's one very famous one still made, Green King IPA. We get the square box out again. Back in the day, there was also Flowers IPA, which unbelievably was even worse. I'm not sure people make that anymore. Certainly Flowers Brewery closed down decades ago, but it was shunted around from one place to another. But yeah, an authentic IPA was a very strong, highly hopped beer. The thing is, when these beers made a resurgence 20 years ago or so, brewers made that point and started implying that their beer they were making was an authentic IPA. And very few people seemed to point out at the time that although it might well be the strength that an old IPA would be, certainly they were using hops that didn't exist 200 years ago, newer varieties of hops. This one actually advertises on it 6-dimensional hop experience, which I assume means it has 6 kinds of hops in, which I'm pretty sure an IPA of 250 years ago wouldn't. And also they're paler than they were. You didn't have any beer that was the colour we're about to see 200 years ago because of malting technology. Even a Pilsner back in the day would be pale brown rather than golden colour. So it's not really an authentic IPA. I think Marston's Old Empire probably is a reasonably good stab at an authentic IPA made with hops of the time, although I suspect even that is paler than beer could have been back then. So anyway, let's have a go at this. This actually says on the back that it's an American style IPA, which I don't think this beer used to say that. I think they've jumped on a bandwagon perhaps of American IPAs being popular. This has been a very successful beer over the years. This came out a good 10, possibly 15 years ago, Jaipur IPA. I assume the beer is the same and it's just the advertising that's changed. So as you see, that's very pale again. We're back to the same colour as Sam Smith's, I think, which is not Old Speckled Hen, it's Sam Smith's. Broadly the same colour. I would call that yellow rather than golden. Yeah, very high in condition, a lot of action going on in that. And yeah, if you smell that, you'll smell something quite different once again to anything we've had before. Certainly doesn't smell anything like the lager, even though it looks like it. You've got a lot of lemon and grapefruit citrusy aromas coming off of that. Some element of pine as well. Once again, that comes from hops. Yeah, so let's give that a taste. Yeah, so quite different to anything we've had there. That's very bitter right from the outset. A lot of hop forwarding on that. And gets even more bitter as beer tends to. We're starting much further up the scale. Instead of going from here to here, we're going from here to here. Yeah. There's a little sweetness underneath that, but not very much. Not very much malt balance, although there is some. It is there. So yeah, that's very sharp. Yeah, you get the light and crisp malt underneath that. It's got the same underpinning really as that lager. I mean, obviously the malt basis is the same because the malt is what gives you the colour. There's obviously more malt in this because it's a stronger beer. But the hop character obviously is much, much more intense in this IPA style. I couldn't drink a lot of that myself. I don't like beers that are ever so sharp and ever so citrusy and ever so hoppy, but that is a well-made example of that kind of beer. It's something you get used to when you're on tasting panels, is making an objective assessment of a style of beer that is not necessarily your preference. I can enjoy that and I could drink that, but I certainly couldn't drink 3 pints of that. But maybe at that strength you're not supposed to, I suppose. Yeah, my problem really with that kind of beer is it doesn't really go anywhere. Once you've had the first mouthful, you're not really getting anything else after that. It's very intense and hoppy, and that's what it does very well, but that's really all it does. But those beers are very popular, so you know that's just me. We all have our preferences and things, but yeah, that's Jaipur IPA. If you like an IPA, you will like that, and you'll also like several other beers that Thornbridge make in a similar style, none of which I can remember the names of now, but you'll be able to find them and track them down. Okay, do we have any more questions, Jake, before we move on to the last beer?
I've got no questions at the moment. Just the usual comments is Jupo is very one of those beers that will put you on the floor.
Yeah,
it can be I find it a very nice beer, but it can be quite abusable. I personally think it's better on cask.
Yes. Yeah, obviously, that's a good point actually. On a technical basis, the obviously being in a bottle, it will be sharper because the amount of carbonation in that carbon dioxide dissolves in water and forms carbonic acid. So any bottled beer with a bit of fizz to it is sharper tasting. So yes, that probably would be smoother and less aggressive in the cask version. Yeah.
We've got another question. As somebody just asked, have they changed the recipe? Is it different in the bottle?
I think that is what we just said. I can't imagine they would have changed it because that has been such a successful beer for so many years. That I think has won champion, whatever category that would be at Champion Beer of Britain. Golden Ale, probably. Before they introduced IPA categories, which is only...
I'll put money on Golden.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it'll be the Golden Ale.
Yeah, but beers like that have tended to do very well at competitions until a few years ago. I mean, obviously in a Golden Ale category that you're tasting like against like. The thing with those beers is they give you a big hit straight off. So when you're in a competition and you're only, like we are now, drinking 2 or 3 mouthfuls of a beer, that makes a big impression on you in a way that actually a more sessionable beer that you might tend to drink more of in an evening, such as a mild, doesn't make that impression in a competition. I think competition judges have started to get wise to that and think drinkability, which is something I've always said on tasting panels. You know, don't just judge the 3 mouthfuls you're tasting. Think, what will that be like? Will you want a 3rd pint of that in an hour's time? Some people would of that, of course. Ignore the actual strength alcoholically of it, but of that taste, that's a popular kind of taste. But I certainly couldn't drink 2 pints of that. It's interesting actually. A lot of older brewers, the old family brewers and the larger Green Kings and Fullers and so on, the brewers there periodically do drinkability tests of their mainstream beers, where they will actually sit after work, I suppose, in the brew house, and they as part of the conditions of their job will have to drink 4 pints of beer, of any one given beer, to assess that is a sessionable beer, because obviously that is what large brewers thrive on. They thrive on beers that go out to their tied houses and people will sit and drink 3 or 4 pints of. And if you're making beer that people can't do that with, that's a significant problem. Obviously, smaller brewers, micro brewers, they deal more with the exhibition house, the beer festival trade, which is not about drinking the same beer pint after pint. So it's a different way of running a brewery for a different kind of audience. But I like a beer that's sessionable, even if I'm only having half of it. I like to think that's a good beer because I could drink 5 pints of that. Okay, any more comments, Jake?
No questions at the moment. Like I got many comments about joining the beers at the moment. That's all coming back, and
Good. That's what it's
like your little bit about drinkability of beers analysis. That went down well. Yeah.
Good.
We're all good.
Right. Okay. Final beer of the day then, and well, not of the day because you've got all this lovely stuff to go back to as the afternoon becomes the evening. And good luck to you. I shall certainly be enjoying them. So I'll show you the beer, but if you followed them so far, you should only have one left. It's that one there. Tring, Death or Glory. It says strong ale on it. A more traditional term would be barley wine. Contrary to people's opinions, or not opinions, but misconceptions, barley wine is not anything different to beer in its mechanics. It is not made as a wine. It is simply a euphemism given the strength, and particularly barley wine used to be more like 10 or 11% in little stubby bottles. Yeah, it's simply a beer that is brewed to a high strength. Now, if you put a lot of sugar in beer, in your wort, which is the unfermented beer, the yeast can't ferment it all. So strong beers, unless you pitch them with wine yeast or do funny things, which occasionally happens, strong beers are much fuller bodied and much sweeter because the yeast just can't get through all the sugar. It can't turn it all into alcohol before it dies. The irony is that alcohol is poisonous to yeast, so yeast creates an environment that kills it. Bizarre, but there we go. Turns out it's a very nice beer in the process. So this is Death or Glory from Tring. It's a barley wine. Most of you have probably had this before. It's been very popular at the Woolpack in Christmas and similar times of the year for many a year running, even though Bentley Bryan drinks most of it. So pour yourself a similar measure of this. You may not want to drink all of this at the moment. Yeah, so you've got a lovely deep russet colour there. Yeah, dark red. That's the colour of really of an Irish red ale. Lovely. Not so much condition as a couple of the previous beers, but life in it, undoubtedly. So yeah, when you smell that, you'll get something once again different, hopefully, to anything we've had before. Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can smell straight off that is alcoholic. Acetone, that's more specifically isoamyl acetate, bananas. Yeah, artificial banana. That doesn't mean they've put bananas in. It doesn't mean they've put artificial banana flavouring in or anything like that. It's simply, it comes out of the brewing process as alcohol degrades in the water. Yeah, so you can smell stewed fruit in that, not just bananas, but the whole sort of dried fruit thing, fruit cake. Yeah, a lot of banana and pear drops, they're similar chemicals, amyl acetate and isoamyl acetate. And the smell of sweets as well, traditional sweets, toffee, caramel. Yes, so that promises something quite powerful in the same way that the porter promised something quite powerful, but different from each other. So there's only one thing to do with it, and that's taste it. Wow, yeah. So as you'd expect from the smell, that's very full, very sweet, with very little bitterness to it. It's got a powerful taste, but it's not powerful bitterness as we found before. That's yeah, sweetness, and there's the characteristic of alcohol in that. We call that vinousness. It has a vinous character. The same character you get off something like port or sherry. Yeah, but it's not gone through any of the processes that port or sherry go through. It is simply a fermented beer. That's just, you start with more sugar, more malt that creates sugar, in other words, and that creates more alcohol, but more sugar is left behind, and that's why you get this body to it, this boiled, sweet taste, black currants. There is some hoppiness coming through. There's not very much. And it's not the kind of beer that relies on hoppiness. It's the kind of beer that relies on the fruitiness. It's a typical barley wine, and actually not terribly strong for a barley wine. A lot of barley wines, as I said, fewer these days because of taxation, I suppose, and drinking habits having changed. But this is only 7 and a bit %. It's not as strong as, for example, Robinson's Old Tom. And incidentally, I've commented on the colour there. That is, you probably know this if you've been around in beer for a bit, but we don't know who's tuning in. So the colour of the beer is nothing to do with the strength. As you see, this beer at the beginning here, that's a mild. That's only 4 and a bit %. Not even that. It's 3.7% actually. Yeah, the colour of the beer comes from the malt. And this is that lovely red colour because it's got quite a bit of red malt in it, I suppose, or crystal malt. It may even tell us. No, not to that extent. It doesn't. Yeah, you can make a beer of that strength that is pale. I have drunk some before. I've drunk a beer that's twice that strong. That was pale. That was an adventure. Yeah, I mean that's a really good beer. And going back to what I was saying before about thinking sessionability, could you drink 3 pints of that? Yes. Alcoholically, no, I wouldn't. Certainly nobody should. But in terms of the flavour, would you still want to be drinking that after you finish the pint? Yes, even though it's not designed for that. Obviously, that's designed for one small bottle or a half at the end of the night. But it's rounded. That's the term I would use for that beer. It's well rounded. Things don't stick out of it. Everything's in balance. And it's smooth and very nice. Jake, how are we doing?
Yeah, we're doing good. People very much joining the little nod to Bentley Bryan there. Yeah, because he'll park himself in front of the pump of this and drink it dry.
Absolutely. I said nobody would drink 3 pints of it. He would, yeah.
Yeah, he would. Yeah. I do find this beer is literally, you got to appreciate it like a whiskey more than a beer, really.
Of course, yes.
Like, it's a very nice beer, but literally a half, that'll be a max for me.
Really? I would have to make an effort to stop drinking that after a pint. I would, yeah.
I could do a pint, but I'll be very, very, let's say, very not a very good way afterwards.
Oh no, sure. I'm not disputing the alcoholic element. No.
Yeah, I do recommend you take care of that one. Not especially that one, but other barley wines or beers similar to that one to take care of that. Yeah. Other than that, we are. I've got some very comical comments. This beer could help beat COVID. Really, it could. I do not recommend it as a vaccine or antibiotic, but still drink it anyway. But we do not recommend it to be a vaccine for COVID. But
no, and it's a waste.
Drink it.
If you inject it, that's a waste.
I totally agree with you on that one. It's supposed to be drunk, not injected.
Right. So thank you. Keep your comments coming in. If you've got some, I'll still answer some. I'll just sum up what we've done there. We've had A range of styles of beers. You got something?
Just a Keith Woolen on YouTube asking the availability of the beers. The beers are, as far as my knowledge at the moment, depending on availability, they're still available at the Hot Beer Shop on Moulton Street in Chelmsford.
Yes.
Please give them a call or drop in. We'll help you out the best they can, or help you order them in. We started on the bandwagon with the COVID. Trump would inject this beer into him, most probably by commenter on YouTube. I haven't got much comments. Any questions coming through at the moment? Let me double check.
Well, keep your questions coming in, guys. I'll just sum up what we've done, and I'll answer any further questions just before we finish. So we've had 6 beers there, all of a different style. That shows the wonderful range of beers we make in this country. Traditional bitter and mild, modern style recreation of IPA, British recreation but authentic recreation of continental lager, all sorts of wonderful things. And it's all out there to be enjoyed, and you'll be able to have it in a pub garden at least soon, and hopefully we'll be getting back to some kind of normality where you can drink these things in pubs and ultimately at beer festivals and so on. I'm not going to put a timeline on that. The decision is not mine. But should you wish to get involved in the tasting panel, you can. It's not an onerous task. It involves drinking beer. I think we manage that quite well as an organisation. Basically, the tasting notes in the Good Beer Guide and the nominations are done on the basis of people giving me their ideas as part of a panel. So the more people can be involved in that, the better. There will be a request going out. I've had an email around this week in the forthcoming newsletter, whatever form that takes, now that What's Brewing is defunct, at least for the time being. We'll see what happens with that one. But if you follow the equivalent online, there will be a request for tasting panel members nationwide. And then your details will be passed on to me, and I'll get back in touch with you, and when we can go to a pub and do training events, which will be similar to this, just more detailed, more involved in terms of the academic input and the knowledge, but not a lecture and not anything boring, just drinking and knowing about what you're drinking. If you want to do that, respond to that request, and we'll get something going, and I'll run a course as I've done before to get you on the panel. If you don't want to do that, that's fine, but we want members for the panel all the time, and all you need to do once you're on the panel is submit a few tastings here and there. You don't have to turn up to meetings every 2 weeks or anything onerous like that. It's just about getting some information in from an informed perspective as to Essex beers, and the more we get, the more likely we are to get Essex beers put forward for national and regional awards, which, if Oscar Wilde, for one, is anything to go by, is certainly what we want. And there's many more decent breweries out there, as we know. So yeah, over to you if you want, Matt. I've given you a taster of the process today, and hopefully we'll get something going in the near future moving along to that. Over to you, Jake.
I've got another question. Phil Winter, I can't pronounce your name, sorry about that. Asking which are your favourite beer from today and why?
Asking me?
Yes.
It's always difficult to pick a favourite, isn't it? I would say Oscar Wilde is one of my favourite beers generally. Going back to what I said earlier, I like a beer that is sessionable, and I've certainly sat in a pub and consumed 4 or 5 pints of Oscar Wilde on more than one occasion. In terms of, well, that beer's good for one. The porter, I think, is very good, as is this one that we're still chewing on now, the Death and Glory. And Black Sheep also, and that's a sessionable bitter at a slightly higher strength than the mild. If push came to shove, I'd opt for the mild. I drink mild as a rule when I can. Partly because if people don't drink it, it will go out of existence, as a lot of them already have. But partly because I just think it's great stuff to have a subtle but well-rounded drink that's available in a pub that you can knock back a few pints of without overwhelming your palate and without overwhelming your legs, so you can still get home. Oscar Wilde, of course, is 3.7%, but a lot of traditional milds are only 3.1, 3.2, and there's some wonderful beers down that strength range. Harvey's mild, Bateman's mild, and I think are wonderful. They're 3 and 3.1%. Yeah. So yeah, Oscar Wilde, if push came to shove, I'd opt for that one, but it's always hard to pick one in particular. Jake?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's one of my favourites, and I will take a group of friends and then North night out. We have literally killed a cask of beer and that's it, and the landlord has come out to us and said, "You buggers, you killed that cask off."
Yeah.
Well, we do enjoy it, so
Yes.
we really went to waste, and we'd be glad to go back to going off the killing off cask again.
Yes, absolutely. And specifically to that mild and that brewery, the quality control at Mighty Oak is excellent, although they had that problem with the labelling of their bottles. I will say on their behalf, that was the bottling plant that did that, which is not at Mighty Oak. They send their beer off in tanks to be, or en masse anyway, to be bottled. And the bottling plant got that wrong. So don't go blaming Mighty Oak for that one if you got one of those bottles of Oscar that was not Oscar, as I did. Hopefully you got it corrected as they've come out now. And if you want another one, there's a big delivery came in yesterday at the hop shop. But yeah, I think the quality control at Mighty Oak is excellent. They make many, many very good beers, and you as good as never get one that's gone wrong, which is more than can be said, unfortunately, for a lot of breweries. Jake, your lips are moving, but I can't hear you.
Sorry, my mic turned off a second there. Sorry, I've got another a question from Phil off YouTube, Phil Winters from Hunderhand. Sorry, if I'm actually right. How much does label / badge play in the beer selection in a pub? Is that right? I'm guessing it's going by the marketing of the pub clip.
Yeah.
By that question.
Difficult to say, isn't it? Obviously, quite often the landlord wouldn't have seen the pump clip before he's ordered it in, if that's what you meant, or if you mean the customer selecting the beer once it's on in the pub. Yeah, I think that counts for a lot for certain people. It wouldn't sway me. I would drink according to what kind of beer I want to drink at any given time, if I could work that out from the pump clip or just a beer list. But yes, obviously, brewers spend a lot of time, or somebody at the brewery spends a lot of time designing pump clips and doing all sorts of things to catch the eye. If you're running a small brewery and a lot of your beer is going out to places such as the ale house with, is it 10 or whatever number of hand pumps they have? Yeah, if your beer can stand out visually, I suppose you sell more. But I wouldn't be the person to ask, sorry.
Yeah, I do feel that question is more of a marketing question than the beer tasting. But
yeah,
like big modern breweries are literally going for more brand synergy. When you walk into a pub or bar, I know that is such and such brewery. I'll go straight to them. Like certain people's, like maybe you and me, will have a nose down the lines, see what's available, and maybe try something new I haven't heard of before.
Yes, but that is not necessarily the typical drinker. Yeah.
But normal, stereotypically going by what marketing and branding does to catch people's eye, to force them to, not force them to say, but to engage them to buy the beer. That's a whole different like I
Yes.
say, a whole different kind of conversation and live stream altogether.
Yes.
A whole different debate, and I could go into that one, but
Yeah, and it's difficult.
okay,
It's
we'll be able
difficult to get a
find
good
time.
answer. It's difficult to get an answer because if you ask someone, "Do you pick the beer on the basis of what the pump clip looks like?" then they'll nearly all say no. But that doesn't mean it doesn't play a part.
Most people be lying on that one.
Yes.
Sometimes you see an interesting pub, but that's interesting. I will say that because I used to study art and design back when I was in university.
Right.
And something as a graphic designer,
Yes.
graphic designer, that will catch my eye as graphics wise. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
If the beer tastes
And a lot
good,
of that's subliminal, of course. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going off on a totally different tangent here.
Of course. Do we have any other comments in, Jake?
Let me just double check. We have nothing on YouTube at the moment. I have nothing at the moment.
No, well, that's fine. Let's call that a day there then.
Shall we wrap it up?
As I said, if you want to get involved in doing something like this more often, it would mainly be by yourself in a pub or with a small group of friends rather than a formal thing, then respond to the whatever it is that's coming around, an email or notification in a newsletter. And we'll do a training session for new members of the panel in the rest of this year or the early part of next year, whenever we're allowed to sit around in a largish group in a meeting room of a pub and taste beer. But also, I guess we'll do something like this online again anyway, even if if pubs aren't open to do this. If people want to do a social kind of event that's social separately online, this kind of thing, an online beer tasting, let's do another one sometime. I can easily rattle up 6 different beers and find different things to say about those. Well, so thank you for your time this afternoon. Cheers.
All right. So thank you, David, for the lovely afternoon. Also like to say thank you to the Hot Beer Shop in Moulton Street in Chelmsford for helping us sort out this event with the beers.
Yes, and these beers should be there, so if whatever you've enjoyed, go and buy them.
And I'd like to say everybody thank you for watching and participating in this live stream. Thank you very much. And also like to remind you to please drink responsibly, and when pubs do open up properly, please go by the government guidelines, please. Other than that, take care, really.
Cheers. Thank you, all of you. Goodbye.